Okay, go to towardanarchy.com, and if you have to, jump into the archive. Look for February 28th. You will see my guest is Dr. Erec Smith, Professor Erec Smith. He is an Associate Professor of Rhetoric at York College in Pennsylvania, and I came across him this last week, read this piece on classical liberalism and the dividing line between Black America, and he'd written this piece, and I thought, wow, I want to reach out and I want to talk to this guy. And then about Thursday, it occurred to me it's Black History Month, and I've had two Black speakers on this month talking about reaching out to the Black community with these wonderful voluntarist, libertarian, anarchist ideas, and it wasn't intentional. It's just this wonderful natural flow of things that seems to continue to go along. So it's another pleasure to have. It really is. I see we're catching some video, so the YouTube crew will be able to see this when it's all said and done. They won't just have to listen. They can actually stare at my bald head. And I see you laughing there, Dr. Smith. But it's absolutely true. It's this idea that you just, instead of trying to fight life and fight things, that you just kind of embrace it and go along with it, that I'm really enjoying right now. So I'm really happy to have you on the show. I appreciate you taking the time. Thank you.
Thank you. It's nice to be had.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. Just this idea of liberty and this idea of the individual that exists in the hearts and minds of Americans, but it seems to be lacking in certain places, and those are mostly politically driven. They don't have anything to do, I think, with race, the color of a person's skin or anything like that. That schism that exists, that misunderstanding of classic liberalism exists in the Black community just as much as it does in the white community, and it's just as hard, I think, to find people and reach out to them in any sense of it, because aren't we always? Isn't it always being suggested that there's this sort of we're trying to run to a place where we can have our hate? Isn't that what you're?
Well, in general, I think we were getting away from the general idea of a deliberative democracy, right? We're supposed to talk things out. The whole point of freedom of speech is that we talk things out. We have dialogue. That is becoming a thing of the past. Why? I mean, there are several reasons to speculate. I have my thoughts regarding the Black community specifically, but people don't like to talk anymore. A difference of opinion is considered an attack, right? It's considered a judgment of you as a person if I disagree with your ideas. Not quite sure where that came from. Perhaps social media mobbing has conditioned people to fear other opinions or things like that. I don't know, but that is definitely falling by the wayside.
Well, as a professor of rhetoric, explain that to me, because I know what those words mean. But what do you do, and what does that mean in this show? One of the things I talk about all the time is words and language and the definition, and I do it for the reason of having a positive argumentation, to be able to reach conclusions, to solve problems.
Well, the simplest or most common definition of rhetoric is from Aristotle, and he says rhetoric is the ability in any given situation to discover the available means of persuasion. Now, the available means. So what does that mean? If you're trying to sing the praises of collecting muscle cars and speeding and stuff like that and having a good time, but you're talking to a bunch of mothers against drunk driving, that's probably not the best way to go, right? You may use different metaphors, different references, if you want to make that message clear to them and persuade them that, it's fun to get behind a wheel of a muscle car or something like that. I just came up with that example. The point is, a situation will both call for and constrain what you can say, right? And that's the simple definition. Rhetoric can move from interpersonal communication to building ideologies, nationhoods and things like that. And that's kind of why I got into it. Like, how do we use words to create and sell, right? Ideologies, right? Sell viewpoints. And a lot of what's going on, in my opinion, regarding differences of politics or things like that, is that we are constructing different narratives, right? For example, in the black community, there is a narrative of, and I get in trouble for this, but I'm going to say it, victimhood and injury, right? Certain things have happened in the past, and because of that, we cannot move forward in the present. And then there's the idea that, we've been given the opportunity, now it's onward and upward, right? We're going to do our ancestors proud and move ahead and progress and succeed in ways that they couldn't. Those are two different ways of looking at the same world. And both those ways are constructed through words, through metaphors, through different references to history, right? And the problem is, each of those narratives come with different values, attitudes, and beliefs. And those values, attitudes, and beliefs bump heads, sometimes violently. And that's where we are right now.
Well, and I guess the problem is with letting any of those go is that there's probably some core truth to both sides, and so neither one of them really wants to let it go. I always look at, when we're talking about the political thing, it's always a tainted argument. There's no conversation that you can have in the political arena that isn't tainted by one or the other ideology, if you will, just sticking with the basic left and right.
I'm a fan of Jonathan Smucker has this book called Hegemony How To, a Roadmap for Radicals. I don't know if you heard of it. It's worth a read. He talks about Occupy Wall Street and why it failed to a large extent, and he talks about insularity. He talks about the lack of desire to reach out and things like that. And he has a term called narrative insurgency. And what that means is you're going to be less effective if you go up to somebody and refute them outright, right? Tell them they're wrong. Tell them their conclusions are idiotic, even if they are, right? Narrative insurgency, however, it looks for commonalities. It looks for the values, attitudes, and beliefs that you may have in common with other people, and it starts from there. And there may be one or two commonalities, but you start there, and you try to build up. Smucker uses the example of creationism, right? And somebody believes in creationism, and you may believe in evolution. Instead of telling them that they're pie in the sky, they believe in a magical person in the sky who creates the world and things like that. You can say, oh, well, there is a passage in the Bible that in which God tells people to take care of His creation, right? If you're an environmentalist, that's where you start, right? So finding the commonalities with these values and attitudes, beliefs, is easier said than done, but it might be a good way to start the conversation and not end it before it really begins.
Well, as somebody who's into communications and words, you know what noise is, and I think there's nothing but noise coming out of everywhere. We have all the troubles of the technologies themselves that cause problems, but everything is sort of an interference in our thinking, and it's getting harder and harder to really decide what is sort of truth from lies or reality from a fantasy, and it gets harder by the minute. So we immediately are defensive when somebody comes at us with any sort of point of view that's different from our own, and I don't know how we get over that without letting go of our own self. Even if we're trying to find something in somebody else, we're still having to let go of ourselves.
I'm a big believer in empowerment theory. A lot of what I write is backed by that. a recent book I put out, A Critique of Anti-Racism in Rhetoric and Composition, talks about how rhetoricians, people who are professionals in communication, can't communicate, right? So if we're not doing it, then how can we expect society at large to go about it successfully?
No, that's true. You're absolutely
Yeah.
right. Go ahead.
Well, empowerment theory, teaches that, in order to feel empowered, to enter into those conversations without feeling threatened, one needs to have interpersonal empowerment, which is how we talk to ourselves, how we have a secure base in ourselves. Interactional empowerment, which is how we interact with other people, perhaps using narrative insurgency and things like that. And behavioral empowerment or political empowerment, which means how do we work together to actually get things done, right? According to psychologists, social workers, things like that, you have to have all three of those components to be empowered. The problem is, and let's use diversity training, for example. A lot of those trainings start with the interactional. They start with okay, how do we get along as a group, right? And maybe they get to the behavioral. I don't know. Everybody skips the interpersonal. And the interpersonal is how you, develop that secure base, a positive self-regard, which is different from self-esteem. Positive self-regard is realistic. I have my strengths and my weaknesses. I know what I can and can't do. I know what I need to work on, right? And it also has a intrinsic sense of security that you can develop through mindfulness, metacognition, thinking about how we think. A couple theorists in rhetoric call it internal rhetoric, how we speak to ourselves, how we persuade ourselves. We're not working on that. We're going straight to how do we talk to each other, instead of figuring out how do we talk to ourselves, be secure enough to talk to each other, right? That way, when you enter into a conversation, it's authentic. It's in good faith. You're not entering into it thinking, how do I protect myself, right? How do I make sure that my statement isn't refuted? Right? Because how do I make sure this person doesn't attack me and succeed in attacking me, right? Which is code for proving me wrong, right? Yeah, so that's what we're missing. We're missing that intrapersonal. We're missing that sense of security in ourselves. We're not working on that. And I try to, promote that. Other people out there are trying to promote that. Chloe Valderi is somebody who has a theory of enchantment form of diversity training, which is basically about this. And there are others as well. I won't get into that. But the point is, these alternatives are out there. And these alternatives are based on how we look at ourselves, starting with us, as opposed to starting with trying to figure out other people and trying to change them.
No, I'm glad that you brought that up. I'm glad that the conversation is going in this direction, because it really does reflect a lot of what is going on in the show, why I do this show every week, the things that I talk about, and it is with that underlying understanding of trying to make people understand the sort of classic liberalism and these ideas of a voluntary existence that I think we should all be supporting. It's about this effort to make myself a better communicator. I think that the message is perfect. Dr. Paul says that it's a perfect message, but we're not perfect communicators. And so I've accepted that. I accepted it long before hearing that quote and knowing that was a reality. It was already existed in that head. So I appreciate what you're saying about understanding and being able to communicate with yourself. I absolutely believe, without a doubt, that my better understanding of the world that I live in comes from a better understanding of myself.
Yeah. Yeah, and we're skipping that, right? A lot of, for example, diversity training, I brought that up earlier, we're not doing that, right? And your Robin DiAngelos of the world, your Ibram Kendis of the world, they really just want to point to people and say, here's what you're doing wrong, right? And that's understandable to a degree. You have to tell people what they're doing wrong in order for them to fix it. But that in and of itself is ineffective. What we can do is talk to each other about how we can help each other with ourselves, right? We can start here and then enter into that conversation. It's not happening enough. And critical race theory is behind a lot of D'Angelo, Kendi, and how a lot of diversity training is going. And that idea is that racism is here to stay. We just have to deal with it, right? And if that's the case, then society at large is systemically racist. And the only way to deal with this is to accept it and do our best to navigate this horrible racist world. All right. The horrible part is not what they say, but they imply it strongly.
Sure.
Right. I don't think that's the way to go. And I think a lot of that comes out of well, I'll say a couple of things. Joy DeGroy is a professor who wrote a book called Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. And what she says there is that a lot of the Black community has not adequately dealt with the aftermath of slavery, the trauma that was created from that. Even to this day, generation to generation, it perpetuates. And what that does is create what she calls vacant esteem and ever-ready anger and things like that, and a bad self-image. And when you have those things, you're not as able to enter into a good faith dialogue as you are if you have positive self-regard, a sense of security, an ability to be self-aware and to manage your emotions. A lot of emotional intelligence comes into empowerment. A lot of that's going on.
Hold that thought. We got to go into a break. We'll come right back. We're talking with Professor Erec Smith right here on Toward Anarchy. Follow along. As always, I've shared some links and information up there. Just look for February 28th. And I shared that article that I was talking about, that piece on classic liberalism and the line dividing Black America, written by Dr. Smith here. That link is up there, as well as some other stuff that we'll talk about a little bit later in the show. But I wanted to get back into this conversation because this is something that I just read about literally just before the show started, and so it's kind of interesting that the conversation will go in this direction. But there was this headline about a Harvard study this week, maybe it was last week, that says reparations could have reduced COVID transmission. And I don't want to dismiss the idea offhand because I did not go read the piece. I'm just finding out about it. But it speaks to me of exactly what you were just talking about, this sort of preconceived mindset that everybody has going in. There's always this in this case, in the black and white conversation that we're having here, slavery is hanging over the top of that conversation.
Yeah, and it still has some effect. I mean, even if not, direct, just the idea that slavery is still affecting us, makes people act or see the world in certain ways. What I was talking about before and how, a lot of the trauma from slavery and Jim Crow has not been adequately dealt with, creates a kind of, and this is not across the board in the Black community by any means, right? But it does start to explain a distrust of classical liberalism. And we can talk about, exactly what classical liberalism is a little bit later on. But it kind of creates what Shelby Steele called integration shock. After the civil rights movement and desegregation, Black people were, well, free, and equal in principle anyway. And they found themselves in a new kind of discourse, right, that they weren't used to. There's no excuse anymore. The doors are open, right? I can pursue this or that or the other thing. And I have to compete with these people I wasn't competing with before because everything was separated. That creates what Steele calls integration shock, which is a kind of insecurity about, being in, holding forth, and navigating mainstream society successfully. So when you have that idea, and you have, certain theories like critical race theory come along, that I'll call it CRT from here on out. CRT is like a buoy that comes along when you're drowning. You say, okay, I'll grab this. Systemic racism. We can't succeed because we're not supposed to succeed. Everything's set up to block us at every way, right? All of these are kind of excuses, security blankets for not being able to successfully navigate mainstream America. Not everybody feels that way. I definitely don't feel that way, and I never have really. But I can't say that for a lot of people. And I think a lot of the separation between people in the black community is about, do I trust this world, right, that I'm in, or do I not? Right?
Okay, we're off into hour number 2. Go to towardanarchy.com if you want to follow along. My guest today is Professor Erec Smith. He is the Associate Professor of Rhetoric at York College in Pennsylvania, and we are just having this conversation about language and about the problems with reaching people. And it's interesting to listen to the conversation, because there's so much gets turned to being about a racial division and about things that are hard for people because of the color of their skin, and from somebody who is an anarchist, somebody who is on the outside of the system, as it were, trying to take an honest look in. What I see dividing people the most is politics. And what I see it using race and color as a tool for division to keep people participating in that system that is questionable whether it functions so well. I mean, the idea of spreading democracy has been by bombs, and within our own country, we seem to be losing our freedoms by the moment. But then again, that may just be my sort of white privilege. I'm really bad at this whole race thing, because I think I'm old enough that I grew up at a time where racism really was still. I mean, it's weird. I'm just really bad at it, because I'm supposed to be racist because I'm white. By virtue of my reality, I'm supposed to just sort of hate anything and everyone that isn't white. And it's not a fair place to start any conversation with somebody of a different color.
Let's try to figure out exactly what people are saying when they say that you are inherently racist because you're white.
Please.
People believe that the system, this country was built on racism, they say. The 1619 Project talks about how anti-black specifically, and anti-indigenous, but anti-black racism is baked in to the American way, right? So if you are going to be raised into a society, if you're going to be raised in an inherently racist society, then you are going to be racist. There's nothing you can do about that. It's not your fault. It's just part of your conditioning. What that tends to ignore is individual agency, right? It assumes that people know what you're thinking. They're psychic, and they can read your mind and understand your intent, and whether something you said was in animus or out of ignorance or something like that. And I think that is inherently illiberal, and it's supposed to be inherently illiberal, because there's no trust in liberalism. Liberalism is seen as a Trojan horse for white supremacy.
Right. Yeah, that's what I started to mention earlier. It's just sort of it's supposed to be this cage, this place where we're running off to be our little racist selves, and that's actually, I try to say, well, that's actually a good thing, because I always make the argument that if people are going to hate, let them hate openly so we know where they are, so that we can avoid being where the haters are.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. And I also tend to think that a lot of these haters um, don't really matter to
Mm.
me,
Mm.
right? If somebody is driving and, let's say I accidentally cut them off. I'm a fine driver, by the way. And they drop the N-bomb. I'm like, okay, that dude, I'll never see that guy again.
Mm.
I'm going to my job and enjoying my happy and successful life, right? And that guy has no bearing in what I'm doing. Now, if one's boss is, egregiously racist or something like that, there's an issue and something needs to be done about that. But when incidents like that do happen, and when in-your-face racism does happen, and it happens a lot less these days, right? What is really happening here? Not, I've come to discover that if somebody's going to say something like that to me, then they have issues, right? They have some serious insecurity that they need to deal with. It has nothing to do with me. I laugh when people act like that. I really do. But if you are working from I won't say a fragile interpersonal empowerment, right? But one that isn't as strong as it could be. Those incidents hit you a lot harder than they would otherwise. Um, for example, at USC last summer or early fall, there was a professor who was teaching, Chinese, and he was using a Chinese word that sounded like the N-word, right? He got suspended. Students wrote a letter about how it was racist and things like that. There is a word in Chinese that kind of sounds like the N-word, and that's what got him in trouble. And I mean, forget about the fact that it's insulting to Chinese people,
Mm.
right? We're basically saying to them, your words are going to mean what we say they mean, right? I mean, there's that. Nobody's talking about that part, but there's that. I mean, that is a sign of what I call low interpersonal empowerment, which is why we need to start working on that and not just jumping into interaction and trying to fix people, right? Let's try to fix ourselves. I think a lot of what is considered, egregiously racist is, something I tend to roll my eyes at and go on with my life.
Yeah, and well, I'm glad you can say that because I don't I don't
Right.
get to say that. I can't say that, and it stands to reason that I shouldn't be able to say it. I don't know what racism is. I am a white man. I have never experienced it that I know of. Maybe I have. Maybe some. Maybe there was some manager or boss somewhere further up the road that I didn't know that had it in for me down, had me fired because I'm a
Hmm.
white guy. But I doubt it very seriously. I don't think that I've ever had that. I mean, words. I've had words thrown at me. I've had
Hmm.
situations where people have said things that were unkind, but again, I accepted it in stride, like you seem to have, and I think it's more about that individual than it is about me. And I certainly don't want to make it any more about me than it has to be. I don't, I don't want that person living in my mind that does that to me.
Well, I'll say this: the individuality you just talked about,
Mm.
that is a primary tenet of liberalism, right? Individuality, plurality, liberty, freedom of speech, equality, and the primacy of reason, right? The primacy of reason. Those things are missing in a lot of people's lives, and then that goes across the racial board. I mean, it's not just but when I see it in the black community, quote unquote community, there's no black community. I mean, Don Lemon isn't hanging out with Tracy Morgan. I mean, they're not, you know, but those things, there's like a tyranny of freedom, right? And people, if they abide by classical liberalism, then they have no excuse for failure, for being uncomfortable in society. All these things are afforded to them, and they're like, oh, I have no excuse anymore for my failure. And and that exacerbates the insecurity, right? And individuality is one of the biggest ones, because this whole idea that I am free and I can do what I want to do, that creates anxiety in a lot of people. I say, wow, I'm free and I can do what I want to do. And some people say, oh, I'm free, I can do what I want to do. There's that different take on the same thing. So ideas like critical race theory excuse that behavior. There is a tenet in Robin DiAngelo and people of her ilk have several tenets of anti-racism. One of them, the biggest one, is, it's not whether racism happened or not, it's how it manifested in that situation. Right? So if something happens and, it's doubtful whether it was racist or not, somebody says something, somebody didn't hold the door open for you, or something like that, somebody didn't say Gesundheit quickly enough when you sneezed, it's not whether or not it happened. It did happen. We have to figure out how and why it happened. Right? And when you have that kind of mindset, I mean, what are you doing? Yeah. Really? A lot of people. Yeah.
That's the mindset that turns racism into institutionalized racism. There must be some valid argument for institutionalized racism, but there's got to be a point where it doesn't exist anymore, when the individual has to be responsible for the things that they think and feel.
Right. There comes a point where, you have agency and you can do something, and it's not pre-1965 anymore. There is a time when you could say these things. Well, there are things in my way that are stifling my progress. And to this day, there are issues with police officers. There are issues with the disparity of educational quality. We definitely have to deal with that, right? But ultimately, when you say things like, everything's racist, we just have to figure out exactly how it is, that is the opposite of progress, right? Institutional racism is understandable. For example, in education, American history is a requirement, African American history is an elective, right? I mean, that kind of thing is, that's a reasonable understanding of institutional racism. And we can do something about that. But when people talk about institutional, or rather systemic racism, they're basically saying it's everywhere. And I find it interesting that the people who are loudest at saying it's everywhere tend to get paid a lot of money to talk about how it's everywhere. I don't know. This seems to be an industry of some sort. DiAngelo, the author of White Fragility, makes $20,000 a gig, right? $20,000 a gig. It was around $10,000, and then last summer happened, and it jumped. I don't know if she wants racism to go away. I mean, I'm not gonna put words in her mouth. I'm not saying she's thinking that. I'm just saying, well, there's some incentive here to keep this going. So there's the incentive of this is an excuse for my inability or lack of desire to do certain things or whatever. And then there's this is an industry, and putting those things together seem quite suspicious to me.
Well, I think the truth of that is represented in this sort of cancel culture. And anytime somebody uses a particular word, especially that word, no matter what, if you're not black, it's racist. There are very few people who aren't black who can use that word. I was listening to Dr. Laura the night that she got fired. This is years and years ago. This was back before there was such a thing as cancel culture, and she used that word. She was not using it in any sort of negative sense in referring to black people, but in this schism between the idea that exists of the people who are using it and the fact that people are making money off of it.
Yeah.
And they're just laughing all the way to the bank as they do it. I think Dave Chappelle pointed it out real well not too long ago when they were talking about him not being able to use the word gay or homosexual
Yeah.
or the other version of it. And they said, why? Because you're not gay. Well, then why can I use that other word, the
Yeah,
N-word?
I remember
Because
that.
I'm not an N-word. Yeah, so, yeah.
And John McWhorter talks about this as well. He says, 20 years ago, a white person could say the N-word in reference to somebody else using it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, as long as it wasn't an actual insult to you, it was okay. Now that person's destroyed, right? And I mean, we can speculate as to why. I mean, the symbolism of a Trump administration perhaps had something to do with that. More instances of police brutality caught on video, which was something that wasn't happening 20 years ago. I mean, there are a lot of things that go into, or that could possibly go into, why things are so, difficult and volatile these days. But the issue is they're difficult and volatile, and they don't have to be, right? They don't have to be. The cancel culture in and of itself, I mean, in its worst iterations, is illiberal as well. I mean, especially if, primacy of reason and dialogue are supposed to be a part of what this country is all about. Can we talk about these things instead of mobbing somebody, and not listening to what that person is saying? Can we re-embrace due process when somebody's accused of racism, to let them, say their piece instead of just fire them and that's that? I don't know if you heard about the Smith College debacle.
Yeah, I think I did.
There was a person, a black student, just accused people of racism, and that's all that needed to happen. People's lives were ruined. One person resigned and went to another job, and the person interviewing her for the job said, "Aren't you that racist?
Aren't you?"
I mean, so and she didn't do anything. She literally didn't do anything. That's where we are. That's the problem, and I think that comes from a lack of empowerment. Right? That comes from a lack of the interpersonal, figuring out, who we are, strengthening who we are, creating a secure base. It comes from a lack of that. And I think it's imperative that we start dealing with that and addressing that. And I know I'm not a psychologist, but I am a rhetorician. And there are some theorists in rhetoric who are talking about this concept of internal rhetoric, right? Or what I have been calling intrapersonal. And actually other people have been calling it too.
Well, this is something.
Rhetoric.
Right. Well, this is something that I actually have found out recently, is that not everybody has an internal dialogue. This is a scientific thing. I didn't realize this. I didn't know this.
I've heard that.
I'm a person who has an internal dialogue. I talk to myself and I reason out what I'm doing, not necessarily in so acute of a description of it, but my mind is constantly churning. There are constant thoughts going through my head, and I'm constantly questioning my reality around me. And I guess some people don't have that. Maybe that's what we have. Maybe there's a certain class of people who are attracted to certain positions of power or things like that. There are some people who make this argument for cannabinoids, lack of cannabinoids in the system, that they are attracted to certain positions because of the fact that their physical makeup isn't quite right.
Interesting. I know nothing of that.
Yeah. It's Dr. Bob. He's been studying it from 1987 or so, that we know about the endocannabinoid system within the brain. And his own anecdotal research on it has suggested that people in positions of power, authoritarians, lack a cannabinoid balance, and which ultimately suggests that they lack an understanding and acceptance of the world. That they're constantly fighting against it, and they're wanting to change it. They just can't accept things for the way they are. We got to go into a break. We'll come back, and we're going to, unfortunately, have to wrap up the conversation with Professor Erec Smith when we get back on Toward Anarchy.
It's happening, ladies and gentlemen. We here at RBN are working with Front Sight Firearms Training Institute to bring our audience the best in combat, tactical, and defensive firearms training. Whether you're a private citizen who is new to firearms, or you have a concealed weapon permit and want a level of training that surpasses what you've received from your local gun range, Front Sight provides priceless education and skills taught by seasoned law enforcement, military, and private citizen instructors to levels that far exceed law enforcement and military standard. With nearly 1 million responsible citizens trained from every town, city, and state from across the United States, Front Sight has bolstered the Patriot movement to a whole new level. Contact Dan Sutterfield by phone at 573-762-2356 or 573-465-2356, or shoot him an email at domedan, DOMEDAN, at hotmail.com. This is a limited time opportunity. Don't miss it.
Folks, we're living in a world the likes of which we've never perceived any clearer than we do now. The plan for global governance has been in the works for generations and would have likely been achieved by now but for the fact that the globalists left open their Achilles heel. With all their tools, Federal Reserve System, fiat currency, no child left behind, and then Common Core education introduced to our schools to dumb us down, vaccines, pharmaceuticals to lobotomize us, GMO foods, insertion of compromised or bought and paid for politicians, judges, mainstream media propaganda, all pieced together like a puzzle designed to ultimately bring the world under submission. But with all their strategy, they forgot one thing: knowledge. And knowledge is power. With knowledge, their bombardment is nullified. Folks, with that, as brilliant and knowledgeable as you've become, among the wisest audience of any radio audience in the world, and you are, I want you to take a moment to reflect and ask yourself, how much of that knowledge did I obtain from Republic Broadcasting Network? How high has my consciousness been raised since I've been a listener? How fast am I now able to discriminate truth from fake news by being a Republic Broadcasting listener? How clear am I now able to see the world since I've been listening to RBN? Ask yourselves those questions, folks. Then ask yourself, what is that knowledge worth to me? Like my morning coffee, how would I survive without it? A voice of truth in a sea of lies. Do we not all need to make sure it survives? Like public broadcasting, we are now finding we can only survive with listener support. Censorship, advertisers being attacked, truth itself being attacked. It's the only way through this. We at Republic Broadcasting humbly ask you to become a supporter. Look at your budget and make a determination of what Republic Broadcasting is worth to you and what you can afford on a monthly basis. Go to republicbroadcasting.org and pledge 20, 30, 40, 50, if possible, 100 a month or more if it's affordable. Click the donate button and become a regular monthly donor. Assure both us and yourself that Republic Broadcasting truth will continue to flow like that morning coffee. The network thanks you.
Steal from black men. The rock and roll industry, Led Zeppelin, Elvis. My conversation today with Professor Erec Smith been a great one. We're talking about rhetoric and just this sort of misunderstanding of really classic liberalism and the ideas of just the individual. It's been a great conversation. We only have just a few minutes left. Did you have any other thoughts or anything that you wanted to add to the conversation before we got to go?
I just want people to know that a lot of people look at the world in different ways. You were just talking about how people for, brain chemistry reasons, they look at the world in certain ways. People look at the world through certain lenses that they have been conditioned to have for one way or another, right? Maybe they've been radicalized as young people. Maybe they've been raised in a certain ideology. And to realize that, this isn't just a conscious decision sometimes, but it's a way that we've been constructed rhetorically to look at the world. And if we can recognize that in each other, perhaps we can enter into things, with a little more good faith, right? And acknowledge that this person has reasons for what this person thinks. I have reasons for what I think. There is commonality going on there, but we got to find it. And if you think that everything is discriminatory all the time, you're less likely to do that, right? So I guess that's what I want to end on.
No, I think that's a perfect place to leave it because it is about a mindset. It is
Yes.
really, truly about you wanting to have honest conversations with people and actually wanting to reach some kind of understanding with them for whatever it is. So often, unfortunately, I think it becomes politically a political question, and politics just taints everything. It just makes things so much harder. I think it'd be so much easier to have a lot of these conversations about social justice, about race, about sexual proclivity, all these things all these constant the barriers that we're running up against in sort of developing the individual when it comes to the state. If the state wasn't there being used to force other people to think a certain way, I think we could get away from so much of it, because the reality is this is what this show is. This is what Anarchy is. This is what all of this is about. You and I, us together, we get along out here just fine most of the time.
Mm-hmm.
Almost everything we do is done without any consideration or thought for what authority or other people think of what it is we're doing. We build society just fine on our own, and it's when these other dividing things are brought up purposely by the press, by the politicians, for somebody to line their pockets.
Yeah, and by university administrators, even, right? And there is a silent majority, in my opinion, right, who's willing to talk and have these conversations and be more open to things. There is a loud minority who seems to be taking up all the limelight here, and knowing that gives me hope.
Yeah, it's another perception thing. It really is. They're just the loudest. They're smaller numbers, but they're louder than the rest of us because they're trying to be heard, and understandably so. And then we also have that other clash, and that's the technology, and that's a thing that separates races. It separates poor and rich. So it's another problem, and something that we ourselves, as a race, as the human race,
Right,
are just really trying to learn to deal with and learn how to communicate and use those tools properly.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I often joke with my students that, like, we weren't ready for the internet.
Mm-hmm.
It was like giving a loaded gun to a toddler.
Mm-hmm.
We totally misused that thing. And maybe when the dust settles, the dust is settling, in my opinion. I think we're realizing some things. But yeah, it's a new way of dealing with the world that, we went crazy with. And, addressing ourselves, how we enter into conversations and things like that, these are necessary steps.
Yeah, we have to take them. And I think we are, slowly but surely. I really think we are. It's the same idea that as they sort of tighten things down, as it gets more authoritarian, the individuals become freer, and we strive. We look for those places to find that freedom, I think.
Yeah. Well, this is classical liberalism is supposed to be about freedom and equality, right? Those are the balance of those things, right? Freedom without equality, I don't want that.
No.
Equality without freedom, don't want that either.
No, they sound really good together and not so
they
great
sound
separately.
good together.
Yeah.
Right?
Thank you so much, Erec Smith. I really appreciate your time. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Yeah, thank you very much.
You take care.